Imagine being stripped of everything you believed defined you: your rank, your uniform, your place among England's elite guards. Now picture that same moment becoming the catalyst for the greatest honor your nation can bestow. This is not fiction. This is the extraordinary true story of a soldier whose fall from grace became his rise to legend. In the shadow of Buckingham Palace, where tradition runs as deep as the Thames, one guard's journey would shatter every assumption about failure, redemption, and what it truly means to serve. From the gilded halls of royal protection to the blood-soaked battlefields of Afghanistan, from public humiliation to standing before royalty once more, but this time as a hero. What happens when the very institution that cast you aside must acknowledge that you've become something greater than they ever imagined? When the uniform they took away pales in comparison to the medal they must now place around your neck. This is the story of courage that couldn't be contained by palace walls, honor that couldn't be diminished by demotion, and a moment when King Charles himself would arrive to witness something that would change how the world sees true service. Some stories are written in gold. Others are forged in fire. This one was born in both. The morning mist hung over the cobblestones of Wellington Barracks like a shroud, and Sergeant James Mitchell knew his world was about to end. He stood at attention outside the commanding officer's quarters, his red tunic immaculate, his bearskin perfectly positioned, every button gleaming with the obsessive care that had defined his 7 years as a grenadier guard. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had never looked more like the perfect guardsman than on the day he would cease to be one. The heavy oak door opened with the weight of centuries behind it. Colonel Hartwell emerged, his face carved from the same stone as the palace walls they were sworn to protect. Behind him, the morning light caught the edge of official papers that would reshape James's entire existence. Sergeant Mitchell. The colonel's voice carried the crisp authority of Old Harrow and Sandhurst, each syllable measured and final. You will accompany me to my office. Now, James had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times over the past weeks, ever since the incident that had brought shame not just to himself, but to the entire regiment. As they walked through corridors lined with portraits of guardsmen who had served with distinction, James felt the weight of their painted eyes following him. These men had upheld the honor of the Guard through 2 world wars, through the troubles in Northern Ireland, through decades of ceremonial duty that demanded perfection in every breath, every step, every moment of service. The office itself was a shrine to military tradition. Regimental colors hung in glass cases, their silk bearing battle honors from Waterloo to the Falklands. The colonel took his position behind an imposing desk that had witnessed the careers of dozens of officers, the making and breaking of countless soldiers. James remained standing, as protocol demanded, though every instinct told him this would be the last time protocol would matter to his military career. The incident at the trooping of the color, Colonel Hartwell began, his words sharp as parade ground gravel, has brought unacceptable attention to this regiment. The photographs in the tabloids, the speculation about the Queen's Guard, the questions about our standards, all of this stems from your actions, Sergeant Mitchell. James's mind flashed back to that day 3 weeks ago. The ceremony had been perfect until the moment when everything went wrong. Standing guard during the Queen's birthday parade, surrounded by thousands of spectators and cameras from around the world, James had made a decision that seemed right in the moment, but would cost him everything he had worked to achieve. A child had wandered away from the crowd, a little girl no more than 5 years old, tears streaming down her face as she searched desperately for her parents. She had stumbled directly into the path of the ceremony, into the space where the Queen's horse would pass within minutes. Protocol was absolute. A guardsman never breaks position, never abandons his post, never allows anything to compromise the dignity of the ceremony. But James had seen that child's terror, had watched as she stumbled towards certain danger, and something deeper than protocol had taken over. He had broken formation. In full view of the assembled crowds, the television cameras, and the royal family itself, Sergeant James Mitchell had stepped from his position and scooped up the frightened child. He had returned her safely to the crowd, ensuring she found her panicked parents. But by then, the damage was done. The newspapers had called it everything from heartwarming to unprofessional. The palace had called it unacceptable. Your service record, the colonel continued, lifting a thick folder, shows dedication and competence. 7 years without incident, commendations for ceremonial excellence, positive reports from your supervising officers. This makes your recent behavior all the more disappointing. James wanted to defend himself, to explain that he would make the same choice again without hesitation. But he understood the machine he had chosen to serve. The British military, particularly the elite units that served the crown, operated on principles that had remained unchanged for centuries. Discipline, hierarchy, unwavering adherence to orders. These weren't mere guidelines. They were sacred trusts that bound every soldier from the newest recruit to the highest-ranking general. "Sir," James finally spoke, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "I understand the gravity of my actions. I accept full responsibility for any consequences." The colonel's expression didn't soften, but something flickered behind his eyes, perhaps respect for James's willingness to face the music without excuses or pleading. "The decision has been made at the highest levels, Sergeant. You are hereby stripped of your ceremonial duties and demoted to the rank of private. You will be transferred immediately to the 3rd Battalion for operational deployment." The words hit James like physical blows. Ceremonial duties weren't just his assignment, they were his identity. To be a Queen's Guard was to stand among the most recognized soldiers in the world, to represent the finest traditions of British military excellence. The tourists who flocked to see the changing of the Guard weren't just watching a ceremony. They were witnessing living history, a tradition that connected modern Britain to its imperial past. Furthermore, Colonel Hartwell continued, "You are prohibited from any future ceremonial duties. Your service will be limited to operational deployments and training roles. The uniform you have worn with such distinction will be returned to stores immediately." James felt the room spinning slightly. The red tunic, the bearskin, the ceremonial sword. These weren't just equipment, they were symbols of belonging to something larger than himself. Without them, he would be just another soldier, stripped of the prestige and honor that had defined his adult life. "Sir," James managed, though his throat felt tight, "I request permission to speak freely. Colonel Hartwell nodded curtly. I joined the Guard to serve something greater than myself," James said, each word carefully chosen. "I believe then, and I believe now, that service means protecting those who cannot protect themselves. If my actions on that day violated protocol, I accept the consequences. But I would not change what I did." For a moment, something resembling admiration crossed the colonel's face, quickly replaced by the iron discipline that had shaped his entire career. "Your convictions are noted, Private Mitchell. They are also irrelevant to the needs of this regiment." The title change cut deep. Private Mitchell, after 7 years of earned respect, of recognition, of standing among the elite, he was back where he had started. Worse, actually, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder to other guardsmen of what happened when personal judgment overruled institutional authority. "Your new assignment," the colonel said, sliding papers across the desk, "is effective immediately. You will report to 3rd Battalion at Combermere Barracks within 48 hours. They are preparing for deployment to Afghanistan within a month." Afghanistan. James had always known operational deployment was a possibility, but as a ceremonial guard, he had been insulated from the harsh realities of Britain's ongoing military commitments. Now, stripped of his privileged position, he was headed directly into one of the most dangerous theaters in the world. "Pack only personal items," Colonel Hartwell instructed. "All ceremonial equipment, including your dress uniform, sword, and bearskin, will remain here. You're dismissed, Private." The walk back to his quarters felt endless. Other guardsmen he passed offered polite nods, but James could see the questions in their eyes, the careful distance they maintained. Word traveled fast in military communities, and everyone would know within hours that Sergeant Mitchell was no longer Sergeant Mitchell. His room in the barracks had been his sanctuary for 7 years. The walls were decorated with photographs from state ceremonies, commendations for excellence, mementos from royal events he had helped protect. Now, as he began packing his few personal belongings into a standard military kit bag, each item felt like evidence of a life that no longer belonged to him. The dress uniform hung in his wardrobe like a ghost. The red wool was pristine, the gold buttons gleamed, and the regimental insignia caught the afternoon light streaming through his window. James ran his fingers along the sleeve one final time, remembering the pride he had felt the first day he earned the right to wear it. Tomorrow, another guardsman would inherit this uniform, and James Mitchell would become just another name in the regimental records. His mobile phone buzzed with messages from family members who had seen the news reports. His mother's text was simple: "We're proud of you, son. You did the right thing." His sister had sent a longer message expressing confidence that this setback was temporary, that his career would recover. James appreciated their support, but he knew they didn't understand the finality of military justice. Some doors, once closed, never reopened. That evening, James sat in the mess hall among his former colleagues, eating what would be his last meal as a member of the Queen's Guard. The conversation around him was subdued, respectful, but distant. These men were his brothers, had been his family for 7 years, but the military had a way of creating instant separation when circumstances demanded it. By tomorrow, Private Mitchell would be someone they used to know, a cautionary tale shared over drinks in years to come. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the parade ground where James had spent countless hours perfecting his drill, he made a silent promise to himself. This demotion, this humiliation, this exile from everything he had worked to achieve, none of it would define him. He had joined the military to serve, and service came in many forms. If the army wanted to send him to Afghanistan, then Afghanistan was where he would prove that James Mitchell was more than his uniform, more than his rank, more than the ceremony that had once defined his worth. The transport truck arrived early the next morning to carry him to his new assignment. As James threw his kit bag into the back and climbed aboard, he took one last look at the barracks that had been his home, the parade ground that had shaped his discipline, the gates through which he had marched as one of Britain's most elite soldiers. The truck pulled away, carrying Private James Mitchell toward an uncertain future and a war zone that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service. Behind him, the morning guard was already taking their positions, the ceremony continuing as it had for generations, as it would for generations to come. But ahead of him lay something else entirely, an opportunity to discover who he was when stripped of everything except his core beliefs about right and wrong, about protecting others, about standing up when it mattered most. The red tunic was gone. The bearskin was back in stores. The ceremonial sword would never again hang at his side. But James Mitchell was still a soldier, and soldiers found ways to serve, no matter what uniform they wore or what rank they carried. The truck disappeared into London traffic, carrying him toward his next chapter, toward Afghanistan, toward a destiny that would prove the colonel wrong about one crucial thing. James Mitchell's convictions were far from irrelevant. They would soon become the most relevant thing in the world. The Afghan sun was merciless, a blazing furnace that turned body armor into an oven and made every breath feel like swallowing fire. Private James Mitchell crouched behind a mud brick wall in a village whose name he couldn't pronounce, listening to the distinctive crack of incoming small arms fire that had become the soundtrack to his new existence. 6 months into his deployment with 3rd Battalion, the polished guardsman who had once stood motionless outside Buckingham Palace seemed like a character from someone else's life. The transformation had been brutal and complete. Gone were the days of measured ceremony and predictable routine. Here in Helmand Province, every day brought new lessons in survival, new tests of courage that no amount of parade ground drilling could have prepared him for. James had learned to read the landscape for signs of improvised explosives, to distinguish between the sound of friendly and enemy gunfire, to function on minimal sleep while carrying 60 pounds of equipment across terrain that ranged from desert wasteland to treacherous mountain passes. Mitchell, Sergeant Torres, called out from across the compound they were securing. Movement on the eastern ridge. Take Henderson and check it out. James signaled to Private Henderson, a young soldier from Manchester who had become his closest friend during the deployment. Together, they moved with the fluid precision that comes from months of operating in hostile territory. Each step calculated, each breath controlled, every sense tuned to detect threats that could materialize from any direction. The village of Sanjin had been their area of operations for the past 3 weeks. Intelligence suggested that Taliban forces were using it as a staging area for attacks on coalition supply lines. But the reality on the ground was far more complex than any briefing could convey. The villagers were caught between competing loyalties. Cooperation with coalition forces meant aid and protection, but it also made them targets for insurgent retaliation. Trust was a luxury that could get people killed. As they approached the suspicious position, James's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All call signs. This is Overwatch. Large enemy force moving toward your position from the north. Estimate 20-plus fighters with heavy weapons. Take cover and prepare for contact. The warning came just seconds before the world exploded into chaos. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the compound walls, sending showers of stone and metal flying through the air. Machine gun fire raked their positions with methodical precision, forcing the entire squad to scramble for whatever cover they could find. James found himself separated from Henderson in the confusion, pressed against a low wall with bullets snapping overhead like angry insects. Through the dust and smoke, he could see that the enemy had positioned themselves well, using the high ground to their advantage while coordinating their assault with military precision. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate his entire squad. Henderson's hit. The call came from Corporal Williams, barely audible over the sound of gunfire. He's trapped in the open. Someone needs to get to him now. James peered around the corner of his cover and spotted Henderson lying motionless about 30 meters away, caught in the open courtyard with no protection from the crossfire that was turning the area into a killing zone. Blood was visible on his uniform, and he wasn't moving. Whether he was unconscious, wounded, or worse, James couldn't tell, but one thing was certain: staying where he was meant certain death. The tactical situation was desperate. The enemy had established interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to Henderson's position. Any attempt at rescue would mean crossing open ground under direct observation from multiple weapon positions. The standard military response would be to call for artillery or air support to suppress the enemy positions before attempting any rescue operation. But Henderson was bleeding out while they waited for support that might not arrive in time. Every second of delay decreased his chances of survival, and James could see that no one else was in position to attempt a rescue. The weight of command responsibility pressed down on Sergeant Torres, who was faced with an impossible choice between following sound tactical doctrine and risking additional casualties in a desperate rescue attempt. Negative on the rescue attempt came Torres's voice over the radio. Too much fire. We wait for support. James understood the logic. Torres was responsible for the entire squad, and losing more men to save one was a calculation that military training specifically discouraged. But as he watched Henderson's motionless form lying exposed onto the Afghan sun, something deeper than training took control of his actions. Once again, James Mitchell found himself facing the moment when protocol and human instinct collided. Once again, he chose humanity over policy. Without waiting for permission, James broke from his cover and sprinted toward Henderson's position. The world around him erupted as enemy fighters concentrated their fire on his moving figure, bullets striking the ground inches from his feet, ricocheting off stones with sharp metallic screams that seemed to follow his every step. Time moved strangely during those 20 seconds of pure terror. James felt hyper-aware of every detail: the weight of his equipment, the burn in his lungs as he ran, the specific crack of different weapons firing at him from different positions. He could hear his squad mates returning fire, trying to provide covering support, but he knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. He reached Henderson just as an RPG exploded against the wall behind them, the blast wave picking both men up and slamming them against the ground with bone-jarring force. James's ears were ringing, his vision was blurred, but Henderson was alive, conscious now and trying to speak through the blood that covered his face. "My leg," Henderson gasped. "Can't move it. Can't feel anything below my knee." James performed a quick assessment while bullets continued to snap overhead. Henderson had taken shrapnel in his left leg, a serious wound that was bleeding heavily, but not immediately life-threatening if they could get him to medical treatment. The problem was that they were still completely exposed, still trapped in the middle of a battlefield with no obvious escape route. "We're going to move," James told Henderson. "I'm going to carry you to that doorway. When I say run, you help as much as you can." What followed was the longest 50-meter movement of James's life. Half carrying, half dragging Henderson toward the relative safety of a collapsed building. James felt bullets pass, so close he could feel the heat displacement in the air. His back was fully exposed to enemy fire, making him an easy target, but somehow, through luck, divine intervention, or the suppressive fire his squad mates were laying down, they made it to cover. Once inside the ruined building, James began emergency first aid, applying pressure dressings and tourniquets while coordinating with the medic over radio. Henderson's condition was stabilizing, but he needed immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility. The problem was that the enemy had effectively surrounded their position, making any kind of extraction extremely dangerous. "Sunray Minor, this is Alpha 2, James called on the command frequency, using Henderson's call sign. "Casualty is stable, but requires immediate evacuation. Request immediate support." The response came from battalion headquarters. "Alpha 2, air support is 20 minutes out. Medical evacuation will follow once area is secure. Hold position. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Henderson was losing blood despite the first aid, and the enemy was clearly preparing for a final assault that would overrun their positions. James could hear them repositioning, could see movement as they flanked around the compound. His squad was down to 6 effective fighters with limited ammunition, facing an enemy force that outnumbered them at least 3-1. But James had learned something during his months in Afghanistan that no ceremonial duty had taught him. Sometimes courage isn't about following orders or maintaining protocol. Sometimes courage is about making impossible choices in impossible situations, about finding strength you didn't know you had when everything depends on your next decision. He keyed his radio again, this time addressing his entire squad. "This is Mitchell. I have eyes on enemy positions from this building. I can provide targeting information for accurate suppressive fire, but someone needs to coordinate with air support when they arrive." What followed was a masterclass in small unit tactics executed under extreme pressure. James used his elevated position to direct his squad mates' fire with surgical precision, calling out target locations and timing their movements to maximize effectiveness while minimizing ammunition expenditure. When the Apache helicopters finally arrived, his detailed intelligence allowed them to engage the enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The battle lasted another hour, but the outcome was no longer in doubt once air support arrived. By the time the dust settled, 14 enemy fighters had been killed or wounded, and the Taliban attack had been completely repelled. More importantly, Henderson was successfully evacuated to the field hospital, where surgeons saved both his life and his leg. That night, as James sat in his tent writing the after-action report, he reflected on how much he had changed since leaving London. The skills he was developing in Afghanistan weren't ceremonial, they were fundamental. Leadership under pressure, tactical thinking, the ability to make life and death decisions with incomplete information. These were the qualities that separated good soldiers from great ones, that determined who lived and who died when everything was on the line. Sergeant Torres appeared at his tent entrance, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a leader who had just watched one of his men exceed every expectation. "That was some fine work today, Mitchell. The way you got to Henderson, the way you coordinated the defense, that's the kind of initiative we need out here." James accepted the coffee gratefully. "Henderson would have done the same for me. We all would." "Maybe," Torres said, settling down beside him. "But you're the one who actually did it. Command is putting you in for a commendation. Could be significant, maybe even a medal." The suggestion surprised James. Military decorations in combat were rare and meaningful, recognition reserved for actions that went far beyond normal duty expectations. But more important than any medal was the knowledge that he had found his true calling. This wasn't about ceremony or tradition. This was about using his skills and training to protect others when it mattered most. Over the following months, James continued to distinguish himself in combat operations throughout Helmand Province. He developed a reputation for tactical innovation and personal courage that earned respect from both his peers and his superiors. The demoted guardsman who had been exiled from ceremonial duty was becoming one of the most effective soldiers in his battalion. But Afghanistan was also teaching him lessons that went beyond military tactics. He was learning about sacrifice, about the cost of war, about the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Every successful mission meant that his friends would come home alive, but it also meant that other men, enemy fighters with families and dreams of their own, would not. War was more complex than the clear moral lines he had imagined during his ceremonial duties in London. As his deployment neared its end, James received word that his actions during the Henderson rescue had been forwarded to higher command for consideration of Britain's highest military honor. The possibility seemed surreal, that the same instincts that had cost him his ceremonial position might now earn him recognition for exceptional valor. But whether medals came or not, James knew he had found something in Afghanistan that no amount of ceremonial training could have provided. The knowledge that he was capable of extraordinary things when ordinary solutions weren't enough. The Queen's Guard had been about upholding tradition. The infantry was about creating new traditions, about writing the next chapter in the long story of British military excellence. The transport helicopter that would carry him home to England was scheduled to arrive in 3 days. As James packed his equipment and said goodbye to the men who had become his brothers in ways that ceremonial colleagues never could, he wondered what awaited him back home. Would there be recognition for his service? Would his military career continue on this new trajectory? Would anyone remember the scandal that had led to his demotion? What he couldn't have imagined was that his return to England would set in motion a series of events that would bring him face to face with royalty once again, not as a disgraced ex-guardsman, but as something entirely different, something that would require the presence of King Charles himself to properly acknowledge. The Ministry of Defense building in Whitehall stood like a fortress of bureaucracy, its Portland stone facade bearing witness to decades of military decisions that had shaped the modern world. Inside its labyrinthine corridors, in a conference room that had seen countless briefings on conflict from the Falklands to Iraq, a very different kind of battle was taking place. One fought with paperwork, testimonies, and the meticulous investigation of heroism. Colonel Patricia Ashworth, Military Cross recipient and one of the most respected officers in the British Army, spread the contents of James Mitchell's service file across the polished mahogany table. After 8 months of detailed investigation, she was finally ready to present her findings to the Honors Committee. But the weight of what she had discovered was unlike anything she had encountered in 25 years of military service. The initial recommendation had come through standard channels from Afghanistan, where James's commanding officer had submitted a routine citation for gallantry. Such recommendations were common enough. Young soldiers performed acts of courage daily in combat zones, and the military had well-established procedures for recognizing exceptional service. What had made James's case unusual was the level of detail provided by witnesses and the unanimous nature of their testimony. Colonel Ashworth opened the first witness statement, provided by Sergeant Torres, James's squad leader during the rescue operation that had saved Private Henderson's life. The language was precise and military in its formality, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. Private Mitchell's actions on the date in question demonstrated exceptional courage and complete disregard for his personal safety. His decision to attempt rescue under heavy enemy fire was tactically sound and morally necessary. Without his intervention, Private Henderson would certainly have died. But as Colonel Ashworth had delved deeper into the investigation, she had uncovered something far more significant than a single act of battlefield courage. James Mitchell's service record in Afghanistan revealed a pattern of leadership, innovation, and personal sacrifice that suggested capabilities far beyond his rank and training. This was not just another brave soldier. This was someone who had consistently performed at levels that saved lives and achieved mission objectives under impossible circumstances. The testimony from Private Henderson himself was particularly compelling. Despite suffering severe injuries that had required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation, Henderson had insisted on providing a detailed account of the rescue operation. His statement included technical details about enemy positions, timing of the assault, and tactical considerations that demonstrated both his own professionalism and James's exceptional performance under pressure. "I was unconscious for most of the actual rescue," Henderson had written, "but I was aware during the evacuation that Mitchell had exposed himself to deliberate enemy fire for an extended period. He could have waited for support, could have followed standard procedure, but he chose to risk his life for mine. The medical team later informed me that any additional delay would have resulted in my death from blood loss." What had truly captured Colonel Ashworth's attention, however, were the supplementary reports from other operations where James had served. Over his 8-month deployment, he had participated in 17 combat missions, 12 of which had resulted in successful objectives with minimal casualties. His squad leaders consistently noted his tactical awareness, his ability to remain calm under fire, and his willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, James's battalion commander, had provided an assessment that read more like a recommendation for immediate promotion than a routine fitness report. Private Mitchell possesses natural leadership abilities that are rare at any rank. His tactical instincts are exceptional, and his personal courage has inspired improved performance across his entire platoon. I would welcome the opportunity to recommend him for accelerated advancement and further training. But the investigation had also uncovered the circumstances that had led to James's deployment to Afghanistan in the first place. The incident during the trooping of the color that had resulted in his demotion from the Queen's Guard had been thoroughly documented, complete with witness statements, security camera footage, and media reports that had painted him as everything from a heartless protocol breaker to a compassionate hero who had put human needs above military tradition. Colonel Ashworth had requested copies of all relevant documentation from the Household Division, including the disciplinary proceedings that had stripped James of his ceremonial duties. What she found was a textbook example of institutional priorities conflicting with individual moral courage. James had violated clear protocols, had disrupted a high-profile ceremony, and had subjected the military to unwanted public scrutiny. But he had also saved a child from potential serious injury and had demonstrated exactly the kind of protective instinct that should define military service. The contradiction was glaring and uncomfortable. The same character traits that had made James unsuitable for ceremonial duty, his willingness to act independently when he perceived immediate danger to innocent people, had made him exceptionally effective in combat operations where such initiative was not just valuable, but essential for mission success. As Colonel Ashworth prepared her presentation for the Honors Committee, she faced a delicate challenge. Military decorations were not just recognition of individual achievement. They were statements about institutional values, about what the military considered worthy of the highest praise. Recommending James Mitchell for the Victoria Cross would essentially validate his decision to break ranks during the royal ceremony, suggesting that moral courage should sometimes supersede military discipline. The Victoria Cross itself carried a weight of history that few other honors could match. Established by Queen Victoria in 1856, It was Britain's highest decoration for gallantry, awarded only for acts of extraordinary courage in the face of enemy action. Only 1,358 men had received it in its entire history, and each recipient had earned their place among the most revered figures in British military tradition. The committee meeting convened on a gray Tuesday morning in November, with 5 senior officers representing different branches of the military gathering to review James's case, along with several other recommendations for gallantry awards. General Sir Michael Crawford, a veteran of the Falklands War and current chairman of the committee, called the session to order with the formal gravity that such proceedings demanded. We are here to consider Recommendation 247-2024 concerning Private James Mitchell, 3rd Battalion, Grenadier Guards for actions taken during combat operations in Afghanistan on the date specified in the citation, General Crawford announced. Colonel Ashworth will present the findings of her investigation. Colonel Ashworth stood and activated the digital presentation that represented 8 months of meticulous research. The first slide showed a map of Helmand Province with the specific location of the engagement marked in red, followed by tactical diagrams that illustrated the enemy positions, friendly locations, and the movement patterns that had characterized the battle. The engagement in question took place on June 15th, during a routine patrol operation in the village of Sanjin. She began. Private Mitchell's squad encountered a well-planned ambush by an estimated 20 Taliban fighters using coordinated small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. One member of the squad, Private Henderson, was severely wounded and trapped in an exposed position under direct enemy observation. The presentation continued with testimony from every witness to the engagement, tactical assessments from multiple levels of command, and medical reports that confirmed the life-threatening nature of Henderson's injuries. But Colonel Ashworth also included broader context about James's overall performance during his deployment, painting a picture of sustained excellence rather than a single moment of courage. What distinguishes this case, she explained, is not just the exceptional nature of the rescue operation, but the consistent pattern of leadership and tactical innovation that Private Mitchell demonstrated throughout his deployment. His squad achieved a 100% mission success rate with the lowest casualty figures in his battalion, largely due to his ability to assess and respond to threats with unusual speed and accuracy. General Crawford studied the documentation carefully, his experienced, eye-catching details that spoke to the quality of soldiering being described. The tactical situation you've outlined would typically result in calling for fire support rather than attempting immediate rescue. What made Private Mitchell's approach successful? Sir, the enemy had positioned themselves to specifically prevent exactly that kind of response, Colonel Ashworth replied. Artillery or air support would have been ineffective due to the urban environment and civilian presence. Private Mitchell recognized that conventional tactics would not work and adapted his approach accordingly. His movement to the casualty position was tactically sound because he used available cover and timing to minimize exposure while maximizing the element of surprise. Admiral Sarah Burton, representing naval interests on the committee, raised another point that had been troubling her throughout the presentation. Colonel Ashworth, the committee is aware that Private Mitchell was demoted from the Queen's Guard prior to his deployment. How does that disciplinary action factor into our consideration of his current recommendation? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and Colonel Ashworth had been preparing for this moment throughout her investigation. Her response would essentially determine whether the military was prepared to acknowledge that the same moral courage it had punished could also be its highest virtue. Ma'am, the circumstances of Private Mitchell's demotion actually support rather than undermine the case for his recognition, she answered carefully. The incident at Trooping of the Color demonstrated his willingness to put human welfare above institutional convenience. His actions in Afghanistan confirmed that this was not reckless disregard for authority, but rather a considered moral framework that prioritizes protection of life above all other considerations. This is precisely the quality we should want to encourage in our soldiers, particularly in combat situations where rigid adherence to protocol may not serve our operational objectives. Air Marshal James Wellington, The most senior officer on the committee leaned forward in his chair. "Are you suggesting, Colonel, that we should recommend for our highest decoration a soldier who was recently disciplined for breaking ranks?" "Sir, I am suggesting that we should recommend a soldier who has demonstrated that his moral compass is precisely aligned with the values this decoration was created to honor." The Victoria Cross recognizes courage, but more specifically, it recognizes the willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the protection of others. Private Mitchell has demonstrated this quality consistently, whether protecting a lost child or rescuing a wounded comrade under enemy fire. The committee spent another 2 hours reviewing every aspect of James's case, questioning witnesses via video conference, examining tactical assessments, and debating the broader implications of their decision. The complexity went far beyond the simple question of whether his actions in Afghanistan merited recognition. They were essentially deciding whether the military was prepared to evolve its understanding of what constituted exemplary service. Finally, General Crawford called for a preliminary vote on whether to advance James's case to the next level of review, which would eventually reach the sovereign herself for final approval. The Victoria Cross could only be awarded with royal approval, making this committee's recommendation the first step in a process that would culminate at the highest levels of government. The vote was unanimous. The committee recommends Private James Mitchell for the Victoria Cross, with the understanding that this recommendation will be forwarded through appropriate channels for final determination, General Crawford announced. "Colonel Ashworth, your investigation has been thorough and your presentation compelling. This soldier represents the best of British military tradition, regardless of his current rank or previous disciplinary actions." As the meeting concluded and the committee members gathered their materials, Colonel Ashworth felt the weight of what had just been decided. Somewhere in England, James Mitchell was living his life as a private soldier, probably unaware that his name was now moving through channels that would eventually bring him to the attention of the monarch herself. But first, there would be more investigation, more review, more careful consideration by officials who understood that the Victoria Cross was not just a medal. It was a statement about national values, about what Britain considered worthy of its highest praise. The process would take months, possibly longer, and every step would be scrutinized by people who understood that they were not just recognizing individual courage, but defining institutional character. The recommendation would work its way through the Ministry of Defense, through Downing Street, through the palace itself, until it reached someone whose approval would make James Mitchell one of the most decorated soldiers in the modern British military. But none of that had happened yet. For now, there was only a file moving through government offices, carrying within it the potential to transform one man's disgrace into immortal honor. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Combermere Barracks, with James Mitchell reporting for what he assumed would be another routine day of training exercises and equipment maintenance. After returning from Afghanistan 6 months earlier, he had settled into the predictable rhythm of peacetime military life. Physical training at dawn, weapons instruction in the morning, administrative duties in the afternoon. It was a far cry from the intensity of combat operations, but James had learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of knowing he would sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row. He was halfway through cleaning his rifle when Sergeant Major Williams approached with an expression that immediately set James's instincts on alert. In military culture, unexpected visits from senior non-commissioned officers rarely brought good news, and the formal way Williams carried himself suggested that this was not a casual conversation. "Private Mitchell," Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of official business, "you are required to report to the commanding officer's office immediately." Full dress uniform. James felt his stomach drop. Full dress uniform meant something significant was happening, but after his experience with the Queen's Guard, his first instinct was defensive. Had he violated some protocol he wasn't aware of? Was there some administrative issue with his service record that required formal attention? The memories of his last formal interview with a commanding officer were still painfully fresh. "Sergeant Major, may I ask what this concerns?" James asked, though he knew the answer was unlikely to be forthcoming. You'll find out when you get there, Private. And, Mitchell, make sure the uniform is perfect. This isn't a routine meeting. 30 minutes later, James stood outside Colonel Harrison's office in his best dress uniform. Every button polished, every crease precise, his mind racing through possibilities. The last time he had been summoned for a formal interview in dress uniform, his military career had been fundamentally altered. Now, 6 months later, he couldn't imagine what new crisis might be developing. The office door opened to reveal not just Colonel Harrison, but 3 other officers James didn't recognize, including a woman wearing the insignia of a full colonel and a man whose uniform displayed decorations that spoke of extensive combat service. This was clearly not a routine personnel matter. Private Mitchell, Colonel Harrison began, his tone formal but not unfriendly. Please be seated. I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Ashworth from the Ministry of Defense and Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, your former battalion commander from Afghanistan. The presence of his former commanding officer from deployment immediately suggested that this meeting was related to his service in Helmand Province. But James couldn't imagine why such senior officers would be involved in what should be routine post-deployment administrative matters. Colonel Ashworth, in particular, carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to operating at the highest levels of military hierarchy. Private Mitchell, Colonel Ashworth began, opening a thick folder that James recognized as an official service record. We are here to discuss your actions during combat operations in Afghanistan, specifically the engagement that took place on June 15th in the village of Sanjin. James's mind immediately jumped to the rescue of Private Henderson, but that operation had been thoroughly debriefed months ago. Every aspect of the engagement had been documented, analyzed, and filed away as part of the standard after-action process. He couldn't understand why it would require renewed attention from officers of this seniority. Sir, I provided complete testimony about that engagement during the standard debriefing process. James replied carefully. Is there some additional information the command requires? Lieutenant Colonel Davidson leaned forward, and James detected something unusual in his expression. Not the neutral professionalism typical of official interviews, but something that looked remarkably like pride. Mitchell, your actions during that engagement and throughout your entire deployment have been the subject of detailed review at levels far above our battalion. The purpose of this meeting is to inform you of the results of that review. Colonel Ashworth took over, her voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering news that would fundamentally alter someone's life. Private Mitchell, based on extensive investigation and testimony from multiple sources, your actions in Afghanistan have been deemed to merit consideration for recognition at the highest level. Specifically, you have been recommended for the Victoria Cross. The words hit James like a physical blow. The Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, reserved for acts of courage so extraordinary that they became part of national legend. He had studied the history of VC recipients during his military training. Men who had charged machine gun nests single-handed, who had held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, who had sacrificed themselves to save their comrades. The idea that his actions might be considered worthy of such recognition seemed impossible. Sir, I'm not sure I understand, James managed, though his voice sounded strange in his own ears. The Henderson rescue was successful, but it was just doing my job. Any soldier would have done the same thing. That's precisely the point, Colonel Ashworth replied. According to every witness we interviewed, no other soldier was in position to attempt that rescue. More importantly, standard tactical doctrine would have called for waiting for support rather than attempting immediate action. Your decision to act independently, under direct enemy fire, demonstrated precisely the kind of moral courage and tactical innovation that the Victoria Cross was established to recognize. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson added detail that helped James understand the scope of the investigation that had been conducted without his knowledge. Mitchell, we interviewed every member of your squad, your platoon leadership, and medical personnel who treated Henderson after the evacuation. We also reviewed tactical assessments of the engagement from multiple perspectives. The consensus was unanimous. Your actions directly saved Henderson's life and demonstrated exceptional courage under the most difficult circumstances possible. James struggled to process what he was being told. The Victoria Cross was not just a medal. It was immortality, membership in a brotherhood of heroes whose names were inscribed in national memory forever. Recipients received lifetime recognition, financial benefits, and, most importantly, the knowledge that their actions had been deemed worthy of Britain's highest praise. But, more than that, the VC carried expectations about character and continued service that would follow him for the rest of his life. The recommendation has been approved at every level of review, Colonel Ashworth continued, including final approval from His Majesty the King. However, the presentation ceremony requires special coordination due to the significance of the award and the level of attention it will generate. The mention of royal approval brought James's thoughts full circle to his service with the Queen's Guard and the circumstances that had led to his deployment to Afghanistan in the first place. The irony was almost overwhelming. The same moral instincts that had cost him his ceremonial position were now being recognized as worthy of the nation's highest honor. "Sir, may I ask about the timing of the ceremony?" James asked, still struggling to accept that this was actually happening. "That's the unique aspect of your situation," Colonel Harrison interjected. "Due to the significance of the Victoria Cross and the particular circumstances of your case, His Majesty has expressed personal interest in presenting the award himself. This requires coordination with the royal schedule and extensive security planning." Colonel Ashworth opened another section of her folder, revealing documents that bore the distinctive letterhead of Buckingham Palace. "The ceremony has been scheduled for next Friday at Windsor Castle. You will be permitted to invite immediate family members, and the event will receive appropriate media coverage. This is not just recognition of your individual service. It represents the nation's acknowledgement that your actions embody the highest ideals of British military service." The reality of what was happening began to sink in. In less than a week, James would stand before the King of England to receive the most prestigious military decoration in the Commonwealth. The transformation from disgraced ex-guardsman to Victoria Cross recipient would be complete, but more than that, it would represent vindication of the moral choices that had shaped his entire military career. "Private Mitchell," Lieutenant Colonel Davidson said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine respect, "I want you to understand what this means beyond the obvious recognition. You have demonstrated that courage is not about rank or position. It's about character and the willingness to act when action is required. Your service in Afghanistan represents everything that is best about the British military tradition." As the meeting concluded and James was dismissed to begin preparation for the ceremony, his mind was spinning with implications he was only beginning to understand. The Victoria Cross would change everything. Career prospects, his place in military history, his relationship with the institution that had once rejected him for following the same moral compass that was now being honored. But, perhaps most significantly, the award represented validation of his belief that service meant protecting others, regardless of personal cost or institutional convenience. The child he had rescued during the trooping of the color had been safe because he was willing to break ranks. Henderson was alive because he was willing to risk enemy fire. In both cases, he had followed his instinct about right and wrong rather than strict protocol, and now the military was acknowledging that such judgment was exactly what they should want from their soldiers. The ceremony would take place in just 6 days, but those days would be filled with preparation that would transform James from an unknown private into a public figure whose story would inspire future generations of soldiers. Media interviews, uniform fittings, protocol briefings, and, most importantly, time to prepare himself mentally for the moment when he would stand before royalty once again. Not as a disgraced guardsman, but as a hero. As James walked back to his quarters to begin the process of notifying his family about the upcoming ceremony, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. Sometimes disgrace was just preparation for grace. Sometimes falling was necessary for rising, and sometimes the very qualities that made someone unsuitable for one role made them perfect for another. The Victoria Cross ceremony would mark not just the recognition of his courage in Afghanistan, but the completion of a journey that had begun with a moment of moral courage outside Buckingham Palace. In 6 days, that journey would bring him face to face with King Charles himself, closing a circle that had begun with his commitment to protecting those who needed protection, regardless of the personal consequences. But first, there were 6 days of preparation for a moment that would define not just his career, but his place in the long history of British military excellence. 6 days to prepare for immortality. The morning of the investiture ceremony dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, the ancient stones glowing golden in the early sunlight that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the coronation of monarchs, and the recognition of heroes across more than 9 centuries of British history. In a private anteroom overlooking the Long Walk, James Mitchell stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his dress uniform with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once defined his service as a Queen's Guard. But everything was different now. The uniform he wore was that of a Victoria Cross recipient, the highest honor the nation could bestow, and in just 30 minutes he would walk into the Waterloo Chamber to receive that recognition from King Charles III himself. The irony was not lost on him that he was once again preparing for a royal ceremony, but this time as the guest of honor rather than the disgraced guardian. His family had arrived the evening before, still struggling to fully comprehend the transformation in their son's fortunes. His mother, Margaret Mitchell, a retired teacher from Yorkshire, had wept openly when she first saw James in his dress uniform with the Victoria Cross ribbon already affixed. His father, a former corporal in the Royal Engineers, had simply nodded with the quiet pride of a man who understood exactly what his son had achieved. "You ready for this, lad?" his father asked, straightening James's medals with the practiced hands of someone who had once worn the uniform himself. Not many get to shake hands with a king, especially not for reasons like this. James nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure that ready accurately described his state of mind. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation, media interviews, and protocol briefings that had introduced him to aspects of royal ceremony he had never encountered even during his service with the Queen's Guard. This was not just a military decoration. It was a state occasion that would be recorded for history. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A palace equerry entered, wearing the distinctive uniform that James remembered from his ceremonial duties, and carrying himself with the polished efficiency that characterized all royal household staff. "Mr. Mitchell, His Majesty is ready to begin the ceremony. If you and your family would please follow me, I'll escort you to the Waterloo Chamber." The walk through Windsor Castle's corridors was a journey through the heart of British history. Portrait galleries lined their path, showing monarchs and military heroes from across the centuries, each painting representing a moment when individual courage had shaped national destiny. James found himself walking past images of Victoria Cross recipients from previous generations. Men who had charged at Rorke's Drift, who had held impossible positions during the Somme, who had flown burning aircraft to safety during the Battle of Britain. The Waterloo Chamber itself was magnificent in its formal grandeur. Named for the battle that had ended Napoleon's ambitions, the room was lined with portraits of the coalition leaders who had defeated the French Empire, creating a setting that spoke to the weight of military tradition and national service. At the far end of the chamber, King Charles stood waiting, wearing the uniform of Colonel-in-Chief of the Grenadier Guards, a detail that James found both appropriate and profoundly moving. As they entered the chamber, James caught sight of faces he recognized among the assembled guests. Colonel Ashworth was present, representing the investigation team that had recommended his decoration. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson had flown in from his current posting in Germany. Most surprisingly, several members of his old squad from Afghanistan were present, including Private Henderson, now Corporal Henderson, whose life James had saved during that desperate engagement in Sanjin. The ceremony itself followed ancient protocol that connected this moment to centuries of military tradition. The king's equerry read the citation that detailed James's actions in Afghanistan, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber as he described the tactical situation, the enemy threat, and the courage that had saved Henderson's life. For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty in Afghanistan, the citation concluded, Private James Mitchell displayed exceptional courage in rescuing a wounded comrade under heavy enemy fire, thereby saving his life at extreme risk to his own. His actions exemplify the finest traditions of British military service. As the king stepped forward to present the Victoria Cross, James felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a physical presence. This was more than personal recognition. It was the nation's acknowledgement that his moral choices, from the rescue of a lost child during the royal ceremony to the battlefield courage in Afghanistan, represented the ideals that British society valued most highly. Private Mitchell, King Charles said, his voice carrying the authority of monarchy, but also the warmth of genuine respect. It is my privilege to present you with the Victoria Cross in recognition of your extraordinary courage and service to the nation. The moment when the king pinned the distinctive bronze cross to James's chest was captured by photographers whose images would appear in newspapers around the world. But for James, the significance was deeply personal. The Victoria Cross represented validation of every choice he had made when duty conflicted with expedience, when moral courage demanded action regardless of personal consequences. Thank you, Your Majesty, James replied, following the protocol he had practiced, but adding words that came from his heart rather than any script. I accept this honor on behalf of all the soldiers who serve with courage every day, particularly those who didn't come home from Afghanistan. The king nodded approvingly. Your actions represent the finest traditions of military service, not just to the crown, but to the principles that define our society. You have honored not just yourself and your regiment, but the nation itself. What followed was the traditional receiving line, where James was introduced to military officials, government ministers, and palace staff who had gathered to witness this rare ceremony. But the most meaningful moment came when Henderson approached, walking without assistance despite the serious wounds he had sustained in Afghanistan. Sir, Henderson said, using the formal address now required by James's decoration, I wanted to thank you personally, not just for saving my life, but for showing me what real courage looks like. The conversation that followed was brief, but profound. Henderson had completed his medical recovery and was now serving as an instructor at the infantry training school, passing on lessons learned in Afghanistan to the next generation of soldiers. His wounds had ended his combat career, but not his service to the military community that had become his family. You didn't save just my life that day, Henderson continued. You saved my future, my wife, my children. Everything I have now exists because you were willing to risk everything for someone else. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests moved to a reception in the castle staterooms, James found himself in conversation with King Charles about the broader implications of his service. The king, who had spent decades as heir to the throne observing military operations around the world, understood the context that made James's story particularly significant. Your journey from the Queen's Guard to the Victoria Cross represents something important about the nature of service, the king observed. Sometimes institutional loyalty and moral courage point in different directions, and the choice between them reveals character. You chose correctly both times. The reference to his demotion from ceremonial duties was direct, but respectful, acknowledging that the same moral instincts that had cost him his position with the Queen's Guard had ultimately led to his highest recognition. The king understood that true service sometimes required challenging institutional priorities when they conflicted with fundamental human values. Your Majesty, James replied, I learned in Afghanistan that courage is not about following rules. It's about knowing when rules don't capture what's really important. Protecting people, especially those who can't protect themselves, sometimes requires going beyond what's expected or authorized. The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on James's plans for his continued military career and the king's perspective on how the military could better prepare soldiers for the moral complexities they would face in modern conflicts. It was a discussion between monarch and subject, but also between two people who understood that service meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond personal interests. As the reception wound down and James prepared to leave Windsor Castle as a Victoria Cross recipient, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been stripped of his ceremonial duties and exiled from the prestigious world of royal protection. Now he wore the nation's highest decoration for military valor, presented by the king himself in one of the most historic settings in the British Isles. The transformation was more than personal. It represented a broader truth about the nature of character and the unpredictable paths that lead to greatness. The qualities that had made him unsuitable for rigid ceremonial duty had made him exactly what was needed in the fluid, dangerous environment of combat operations. His willingness to put human welfare above institutional convenience had been vindicated at the highest levels of military and royal recognition. But perhaps most importantly, James understood that the Victoria Cross was not an ending, but a beginning. As one of only a handful of living VC recipients, he now carried responsibilities that would extend far beyond his military career. He would be expected to represent the values that the decorations symbolized, to inspire future generations of soldiers, and to embody the principle that true service sometimes requires extraordinary courage. As his family gathered for photographs outside the castle, James looked back at the ancient walls that had witnessed so much history, so many moments when individual courage had shaped national destiny. Today had added another chapter to that story, another example of how ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary circumstances when character and opportunity intersected. The drive back to London took them past landmarks that had defined James's military career: the barracks where he had trained as a young recruit, the parade grounds where he had learned ceremonial drill, the government buildings where decisions about his future had been made by people he had never met. But now he was returning as something different, something that would fundamentally alter how he understood his role in the long tradition of British military service. The Victoria Cross ceremony was over, but its implications would resonate for the rest of James's life and beyond. He had become part of a brotherhood of heroes whose names would be remembered long after the circumstances that created their fame had faded into history. More than that, he had proven that moral courage, regardless of the personal cost, was not just valued, but essential to the society he had sworn to protect. As their car disappeared into London traffic, carrying James Mitchell back to his new life as a Victoria Cross recipient, the story that had begun with a lost child and a broken formation had reached its culmination. But like all great stories of service and sacrifice, it was also a beginning, the start of a legacy that would inspire others to choose courage over convenience, humanity over protocol, and service over self when a moment demanded nothing less than their very best.